They told you the Old West was about quick-draw duels at high noon. 2 men, Main Street, honor. That's a lie. The reality was far uglier, far more random, and far more frequent than any movie ever showed you. Between 1850 and 1890, the homicide rate in cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene was over 100 times higher than modern American cities. Not double, not 10 times, 100. But here's what they didn't teach you in school. Most men didn't die in fair fights. They died drunk, shot in the back, killed over a card game by someone whose name no one remembered a week later. The violence wasn't cinematic. It was cheap, constant, and it destroyed entire communities. You think you know the West because you've seen the movies. You've watched Clint Eastwood stand tall. You've seen John Wayne deliver justice with a 6-shooter. But those films were designed to sell you a fantasy. The real West? It smelled like gunpowder, whiskey, and death. It sounded like screaming in the night and silence in the morning when another body was dragged to Boot Hill. Hollywood gave you heroes. History left behind unmarked graves and widows who never got justice. This is what really happened. And once you hear it, you'll never watch a Western the same way again. Let's start with the numbers they buried. In Dodge City, Kansas, between 1876 and 1885, the recorded murder rate was 165 homicides per 100,000 people annually. For comparison, modern Chicago sits around 18, Detroit around 40. Even the most dangerous American cities today don't come close. This wasn't gang warfare. This wasn't organized crime. This was everyday life. Why? Because the Old West had 3 ingredients Hollywood never mentions together: isolated men, alcohol, and firearms, with almost no law enforcement. Towns like Deadwood, South Dakota, had 1 sheriff for over 5,000 transient miners, drifters, and gamblers. 1 man, no backup, no forensics, no district attorney, no real justice system to speak of. When a man was killed, there might be a coroner's inquest, maybe, but most of the time, the body was buried, the killer left town on the next stage, and life went on. Most killings went unsolved, most killers walked free, and most victims, their families never even knew how they died. Here's another fact they don't mention: many Western towns didn't even have jails. If you arrested someone, you had to chain them to a post or lock them in a back room of a saloon until the circuit judge arrived, which could take weeks or months. And if the accused had friends, they'd break him out, or they'd kill the man who arrested him. The West wasn't wild because of outlaws. It was wild because there was no structure, no accountability, and no consequences for most acts of violence. You've been sold the myth of the gunfighter, the honorable man who only killed when he had to. The truth is, most men who killed did it once, got away with it, and disappeared into history. No trial, no record, just another name forgotten in a dusty ledger that burned in a fire 30 years later. Here's what got men killed: not being fast, being drunk. The majority of homicides in the Old West happened inside saloons, after midnight, during card games or arguments over women who worked the rooms upstairs. A man named Tom O'Folliard was shot in the back in 1880, not in a duel, but while walking away from an argument in a bar in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. His killer? A drifter no one knew. The case was never solved. O'Folliard's body was buried in an unmarked grave, and within a week, no one even talked about it anymore. Another man, a cowboy named Jim Courtright, survived multiple gunfights, then died because he drew his pistol while drunk and fumbled the hammer. His opponent didn't hesitate. Courtright bled out in the dirt outside the White Elephant Saloon in Fort Worth while onlookers went back to their drinks. This was the pattern: hesitation, alcohol, poor judgment, not heroism. And here's the part that makes it worse. Many men carried guns but had never fired them in a real confrontation. The first time they tried, their hands shook, their aim failed, and they died learning they weren't the man they thought they were. One account from a Dodge City newspaper in 1878 described a shooting where both men drew, both fired, and both missed, at a distance of less than 10 feet. One reloaded faster, the other died begging. The error wasn't being slow, it was believing the myth that courage and a gun were enough. It wasn't, and the men who learned that lesson didn't get a second chance. Now let's talk about what they never put in the movies. Most violence in the Old West wasn't white hat versus black hat. It wasn't lawman versus outlaw. It was racial. It was economic. And it was systematic. Chinese laborers in mining camps were beaten, robbed, and murdered with near impunity. In Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885, white miners killed 28 Chinese workers and burned their homes to the ground. Federal troops were called in, not to arrest anyone but to restore order. No one was ever convicted. The Chinese survivors were given no compensation. They were simply told to leave. Native Americans weren't just fighting the cavalry in pitched battles you see in films. They were being hunted by civilian posses, scalped for bounties paid by territorial governments, and displaced by men who saw murder as a business opportunity. In Texas, rangers were paid per scalp. It didn't matter if the victim was a warrior or a child. The incentive was killing, not justice. And former Confederate soldiers, angry, broke, and traumatized from the Civil War, roamed territories like Missouri and Kansas, forming gangs that preyed on freed black families trying to homestead under the Homestead Act. These weren't outlaws in the romantic sense. They were terrorists, and local authorities often looked the other way or joined them. One example, the Bald Knobbers of Missouri, a vigilante group that started as community protection turned into a reign of terror, lynching dozens of men without trial. Some victims were criminals. Most were just poor farmers who had disputes with the wrong people. But Hollywood erased all of that, because the truth is uncomfortable. The Old West wasn't a place where good guys won. It was a place where violence was currency, and the men who used it best controlled everything. This wasn't frontier justice. It was frontier chaos. And the people who suffered most were the ones history forgot entirely. So what happened to the men who survived? Most of them didn't live long. Wild Bill Hickok, one of the most famous gunfighters in American history, was shot in the back of the head while playing poker in Deadwood, South Dakota. He was 39 years old. His killer, Jack McCall, claimed self-defense. He was acquitted, then later retried and hanged. But Hickok stayed dead. Jesse James, the Confederate guerrilla turned bank robber, was killed by a member of his own gang for reward money. He was 34 years old, shot in the back while adjusting a picture on his wall. John Wesley Hardin, who claimed to have killed over 40 men, spent 16 years in prison, was released, became a lawyer, and then died in an outhouse in El Paso, shot in the back by a local constable settling a personal grudge. He was 42. The ones who survived into old age? They spent their final years haunted, broke, or working as paid attractions in traveling Wild West shows, reenacting the violence they could never escape. Wyatt Earp outlived most of his peers, but buried 2 brothers, watched his wife succumb to addiction, and spent decades fighting lawsuits and accusations. By the time he died in 1929, most people had forgotten who he was. Hollywood resurrected him. History had moved on. And the widows, the children, the families left behind, they got nothing. No pensions, no support, just the bill for a wooden casket and a grave no one would visit. The psychological cost was invisible then, but the records show it. Addiction, suicide, and men who could never adjust to peace. Some turned to opium, others drank themselves to death. A few just wandered into the desert and were never seen again. This is what violence actually does. It doesn't make legends, it makes ghosts. They sold you the Old West as a place where men were free, where justice came from a fast hand and a steel nerve, where the righteous always won and the guilty always paid. But the truth is simpler and darker. The Old West was a place where violence was so common, it stopped being shocking, where most killings went unpunished, where the men who survived weren't the bravest, they were the luckiest or the cruelest. Hollywood gave you mythology. History left behind morgue records, unmarked graves, and census reports showing entire towns that vanished because the violence never stopped. The next time you watch a Western, ask yourself, whose story are you seeing? The gunslinger who walks away clean, or the man who bled, out in the mud while a crowd watched and did nothing? Because the real Old West wasn't won by heroes. It was survived by the ones history forgot. And the violence, it was far worse than you were ever told.